How often have we as Freemasons remained silent when hearing misconceptions about our craft? And we then fail to recognise that this silence goes directly against the non-negotiable duty of every Mason. Now, that non-negotiable duty is to protect the reputation of not only our fellow brethren, but Freemasonry as a whole. It's this responsibility that demands we protect our fellow Masons' reputations through the phrase in our ceremonies, "I will not injure him myself, nor knowingly suffer others to do so, if in my power to prevent it, but on the contrary, will boldly repel the slanderer of his good name." And this phrase in the ritual is a commitment that not only extends to defending our individual brothers, but to Freemasonry itself as an institution. And when we hear misconceptions about our craft and remain silent, we fail to protect the collective reputation that generations of Masons have built and maintained. You see, many Masons misunderstand this responsibility, especially when encountering public misinformation about Freemasonry, and silence violates this sacred promise. So in this edition of Not So Daily Masonic Progress, we're going to uncover what dimensions of our protective responsibility might we be overlooking, and how does this shape what we truly must defend. We'll navigate the delicate progression from personal restraint to active defense without compromising our core principles. And what profound connections exist between defending the reputation and the spiritual lessons embedded with our degrees. And by the end, we'll reveal that defending our craft is not optional, but it is the non-negotiable duty of every Mason. It's a commitment that transforms our fraternity from some mere association to a living force for truth, especially in an era of disinformation. So, having established the importance of this key responsibility, we must first understand exactly what we are protecting. Because before we can fulfill our duty, we need clarity on what forms of harm we're actually called to prevent, both to individual members and to Freemasonry itself. So the non-negotiable duty of every Mason begins with the promise to protect our brothers. It's a responsibility that reveals its true complexity when we examine what we have sworn to defend. When we first hear the obligation to protect our brothers, well, we assume it refers primarily to physical protection or perhaps defending their character when they're directly attacked. But in reality, it's this commitment, it actually encompasses a much broader spectrum of potential injuries that, as Masons, we must be vigilant to protect. You see, our protective duty extends to multiple dimensions of human well-being, and it creates a comprehensive ethical framework that addresses harm in all of its forms. First, there's physical harm, and that represents the most obvious category. Things like violence, threats, or actions that endanger the bodily well-being of a brother. Now, as modern Masons, we rarely face physical dangers directly related to our membership, and this protection, though, extends to situations where a brother might be at risk in his business dealings, or his community activities, or even his personal circumstances. You see, it's this aspect of protection that has roots in the operative Mason's duty to ensure the workplace is safe for fellow craftsmen. But on a side note, when we refer to workplace, we're not referring to the workplace as in our 9-to-5 jobs. We're referring to the lodge being symbolic or emblematic of a workplace. But we have to remember that we're not actually employed the same way under law that you might be at your company. And this is not to then say, oh, volunteers are then employees. No, you are a member of an organisation. And the symbolic employment is actually to build the temple, like we've discussed before. But you're building the temple of yourself. So do not make the mistake of conflating workplace law around employment with the tribalism of our employment as Masons. But then there's also emotional injuries, as we get back on track. And these go beyond mere hurt feelings to include things like verbal abuse, bullying, humiliation, or really any action that can cause, distress. It's these injuries that can occur during lodge meetings or social gatherings or even in private conversations. When brothers engage in harsh criticism, exclusionary behaviour, or dismissive treatment of another's contributions, they do inflict emotional wounds that violate our protective duty. But the harmony of the lodge, a fundamental and core Masonic principle, depends heavily on preventing such emotional harm. There's also reputational damage, and that involves the spreading of rumours, gossip, false accusations, or sharing private matters that undermine a brother's standing within the lodge or the broader Masonic community. And this form of injury can be particularly insidious because it often occurs in a brother's absence, especially when he can't defend himself. You see, a casual negative comment about a brother's character or abilities, even if it's meant as humour, can spread and grow. Or these harsh criticisms that we have of our brethren as they go about performing their duties. You see, these can actually cause lasting damage to how others perceive him. It's this dimension of protection that lies at the heart of our obligation, as a man's reputation represents his social capital and his personal honour. Now, naturally, there's also financial injury, and that encompasses things like theft, fraud, unfair business practices, or causing economic harm. This includes obvious violations like failing to repay debts to a brother or pay your dues to a lodge. But it also extends to withholding business opportunities or exploiting a brother's trust in financial matters. Or even failing to provide fair value in those business dealings. Now, I don't condone at all doing business dealings with another brother, but sometimes they're unavoidable. When we do, we need to make sure that we are defending their character in their absence as well as in their presence. Our ancient operative tradition included protecting a fellow craftsman's livelihood. And it's this dimension that remains equally important today, especially when we interact with a brother in business or in financial contexts, even within Freemasonry and without it. But there's also professional injury, and that includes undermining a brother's career or spreading false information about their work, failing to provide promised professional support, or hindering their advancement. In today's competitive workplace, this form of injury can be subtle, and perhaps failing to mention a qualified brother for an opportunity, or offering faint praise when strong endorsement was promised, or allowing the misconceptions about a brother's professional capabilities to go uncorrected. As careers present our livelihood, but personal fulfillment and contribution to society, it's this particular dimension that merits particular attention. But what we see is these dimensions frequently overlap and interact. For example, if we're gossiping about a brother's business practices, maybe he's not that good a tradesman. Well, this is reputational harm, and it might also damage his professional standing, causing professional injury. And it can ultimately affect his income, causing financial industry. And it's these cascade of effects that harms and demonstrates exactly why we must protect. And it's our duty that we must be comprehensive rather than narrowly defined. So have you considered that how many of these dimensions just might be relevant in your daily interactions with your brothers? But the other thing is, this doesn't just extend to Freemasonry. When we refer to brothers, we should also be referring to our fellow beings. And that means that these principles that we're talking about extend not just inside of Lodge, but they extend to how we go about in our workplace. If you think about it, what we're doing at Lodge is training. It's a playground for real life. So Freemasonry is calling us to do these towards our brothers. It's actually calling us to do the same with our family, with our friends, and with our colleagues in the actual workplace. So when we say brother, we mean our brothers of this human race. So when we speak about a brother in his absence, do you remain mindful of your promise not to injure his reputation? Or when hearing about business opportunities, do you consider brothers that might benefit from that information? Well, these everyday situations test our commitment to this multidimensional protection. But then there's also institutional detection, and it's defending Freemasonry itself. You see, the reputation of Freemasonry as an institution, it demands the same protection as the reputation of any individual Mason. Indeed, when these public misconceptions about the craft go unchallenged, every Mason suffers by association. You see, the collective good name of our fraternity represents the accumulated honour of countless brothers across centuries. And the mindset of ignoring misinformation directly contradicts the spirit of our Masonic promises. And before concluding that intervention is not in our power, we should actually explore all available options, from direct conversation, seeking guidance from experienced Masons, or bringing the matter to the appropriate lodge authorities, or even if necessary, involving Grand Lodge for assistance. So let's consider the typical workplace scenario. We have Thomas, who's a Mason, and he sits uncomfortably silent as a co-worker describes Freemasonry as a secret society with a weird ritual. Or maybe there's an example of Brother Williams, right? He scrolls past social media posts filled with the conspiracy theories about Masonic symbols, thinking that only engaging would just give it more attention. Or a hypothetical Brother Anderson who hears a lodge brother spreading misinformation about another member's business practices and tells him it's not my place to get involved. You see, in each case, the Mason finds reason to avoid the discomfort of intervention, often misinterpreting the "if in my power" as permission for inaction, rather than a call to expand their influence. And as we examine these dimensions and examples, what essential questions do then emerge? Well, when two brothers are in conflict, how do we then fulfill our responsibility to both? When the criticism of a brother is legitimate, how do we distinguish between fair accountability and slander that requires intervention? You see, it's these questions that lead us to develop a deeper exploration of our protective duties. And now that we understand that we must protect, we do face an even more challenging question. How far must we go to fulfill this responsibility? Is simply avoiding this harmful behaviour ourselves enough, or does our promise demand more active involvement than most of us may be comfortable in providing? Well, there's 3 progressive levels that go beyond passive restraint. And then the non-negotiable duty of every Mason, because it manifests through these distinct levels in that responsibility. You see, each level demands greater moral courage and active intervention. And it can initially appear as a simple commitment. It actually reveals a comprehensive ethical framework that transforms passive observers into guardians of our fraternal reputation. So level 1 is personal restraint. It's the foundation, because we need to be refraining from causing harm ourselves. And like a physician who pledges to do no harm, every Mason begins with this fundamental commitment of personal restraint. But this alone is insufficient for true brotherhood. And this foundation does require constant self-awareness and mastery over these harmful impulses that arise in moments of frustration or disagreement. Bring your attention to the common gavel. It represents the force of conscience, which should keep down all vain and unbecoming thoughts, so our words and actions may ascend pure and undefiled. But it also means carefully monitoring our words about brothers in their absence and about Freemasonry when we speak with non-Masons. Then we have level 2, which is active prevention, and it's about intervention and awareness. You see, the second level calls us beyond this passive non-harm into active prevention. And this is where, as many Masons falter, we misinterpret the responsibility as merely personal rather than collective. You see, when we witness these harmful words or actions directed at a brother or directed at Freemasonry itself, and we remain silent, we become complicit in that same harm. You see, our vow explicitly rejects this passive stance. It calls us to intervene within our sphere of influence. So the phrase, "if in my power," which is often misinterpreted as a convenient limitation rather than an empowering call to action. We need to consider how often we might witness potentially harmful words or actions directed towards brethren or Freemasonry, and we remain silent, telling ourselves, hey, it's not my place to intervene, or they need to resolve it themselves. Because the word knowingly in this verse of the ritual is significant. It emphasizes awareness and a conscious choice. You see, it requires us Masons to be attentive to these potential threats to our brothers' well-being and their reputation. And pleading ignorance through inattention or willful blindness cannot excuse inaction. You see, it's this aspect of our duty that calls us to heightened awareness of both overt and subtle forms of injury that might target our fraternity as a whole. And then we have level 3, which is bold confrontation. It means courage in defense of our craft. You see, this third level of actively confronting those who damage reputation, it requires the greatest moral courage, because the directive to act boldly stands in stark contrast to the hesitation and the discomfort we feel when we face these potential conflicts. You see, this boldness does not imply aggression or hostility, but rather clarity and confidence and principled action in the defense of truth. You see, this isn't a call for passive defense or quiet disagreement, but a forthright confrontation of falsehood and disinformation. And many Masons find this aspect of their duty the most challenging, as it may require some uncomfortable confrontations or even social risk. Yet it's precisely this courage that distinguishes true fraternal protection from mere abstract goodwill. You see, these responsibilities represent a unified system of fraternal protection. It's not separate, it's not optional. To fulfill one while neglecting the others represents an incomplete understanding of our Masonic duty. The Mason who refrains from causing harm himself but stands silently while others spread falsehoods about our fraternity has failed to uphold the completeness of this promise. So consider how this responsibility manifests in everyday situations. When a brother criticizes another Mason behind his back, our duty begins not with participating in such talk, but it doesn't end there. We must also discourage the conversation and, if necessary, actively defend the absent brother's character. Similarly, when encountering public misconceptions about Freemasonry, mere personal disagreement is insufficient. Our promise calls us to actively correct these falsehoods. You see, true Masonic growth involves continually enlarging our sphere of influence and developing the moral courage to intervene when necessary. You see, it's these 3 levels of protection that offer a clear path for action. But one fundamental question remains. Are there any valid exceptions to this responsibility, or is it truly absolute in ways that leave no room for convenient excuses or uncomfortable situations? At the heart of this non-negotiable duty of every Mason, there lies a profound truth that transforms our understanding. You see, there are virtually no legitimate excuses for failing to defend a brother's reputation or the good name of the craft. And this revelation draws our attention. The absolute nature of this responsibility leaves no room for comfortable evasion or convenient equivocation. I wonder where we've heard those 2 words before. Evasion and equivocation. You see, this absolute quality reveals the true significance of our Masonic promises. It is not merely a rule of conduct, but a transformative commitment that elevates Freemasonry from some mere system of personal ethics to a genuine brotherhood of mutual protection. And without this commitment, the fraternity would be nothing more than a social club or some philosophical society. It's this willingness to stand in defense of our brothers, even when inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly, that creates bonds of trust and mutual support that define true brotherhood. It's this sacred trust that connects us to the deeper spiritual dimension of our degrees. Masonic tradition suggests that this aspect of our ritual is part of the drama of the immortality of the soul. And it's setting forth that truth that while a man's body may wither away and perish, the man himself perishes not. It's this perspective that reveals our commitment that to protect a brother's reputation is not merely about social standing, but about honouring something immortal and transcendent in every man. You see, a man's good name represents more than his public image. It embodies his essential character, his moral worth, and his contribution to the human community. And by defending his good name, we affirm that our recognition of this immortal value goes beyond temporal circumstances. We acknowledge that, yes, physical harm may affect the body, but damage to reputation can wound the spirit in ways that endure for far longer. This principle applies with equal force to our brothers and to the fraternity itself. Freemasonry's collective reputation embodies the accumulated moral worth of the contributions of countless brothers across time and space. And when we defend the craft against slander and misrepresentation, we not just honour the institution, but the immortal essence of brotherhood that transcends every individual Mason. The reputation of Freemasonry and the reputation of each brother are inextricably linked. An injury to one is an injury to all. You see, this spiritual dimension transforms our understanding from this vow or promise that appears to be a burden of a duty, but it becomes a sacred privilege. You see, we're not merely following the rules. We are participating in the preservation of something eternal in our brothers and in extension ourselves. When we confront falsehoods of slander, we're not simply correcting misunderstandings, but standing in defense of immortal truth against the falses and destruction. This revelation changes everything. It removes temptation to seek excuses or exceptions. It eliminates impulse to weigh convenience against duty, and it elevates our protection from mere social courtesy to a spiritual imperative. So in this light, the absolute nature of our responsibility becomes not a harsh demand, but a natural expression of our recognition of each other's transcendent worth. So, having recognized this sacred trust as a privilege rather than a mere duty, we now have to consider how to translate this elevated understanding into practical application, especially in this modern world. You see, the deeper meaning behind protecting reputations explains why no excuse is valid. But how does the commitment work in the digital world? You see, ancient wisdom needs that practical application in modern challenges that earlier generations of Freemasons could never have imagined. So in fulfilling this non-negotiable duty, every Mason becomes challenged when we attempt to translate our philosophical understanding into these practical actions. And we have recognized the profound nature of our protective responsibility. We have to consider its application in those complex realities. How do we honour this unwavering commitment across various contexts and challenges that our predecessors scarcely imagined? Well, when members of the public spread misinformation or disinformation about Freemasonry, our sacred trust becomes particularly relevant. So consider how often we encounter the misconceptions about the fraternity. The YouTube video version of this is going to have 1,000,001 comments full of misconceptions, full of slander, and full of people saying that all kinds of things about us, and they're going to be completely wrong. You know, things like the claims that we're this secret society with nefarious goals. We're a religion competing with established faiths, or we're this self-serving network focused on personal gain at the expense of others. So when we encounter such falsehoods and we remain silent, we're failing to fulfill that promise to protect the collective good name. And with our absolute commitment in mind, we recognize that our responsibility extends to protecting the individual brothers. We need to protect Freemasonry itself. So when we hear these inaccurate portrayals of our principles and our practices, we choose not to correct them, perhaps from a desire to avoid these conversations or conflict. Well, we're neglecting that duty. Because the phrase, "if in my power," is not an escape clause, but a call to recognize and use whatever influence we have, whether through calm conversation, thoughtful correspondence, or public education. It means not standing by and ignoring those comments or those videos. So now that we're armed with an understanding of how our sacred pledge, we must consider how that Mason might respond when overhearing these things. So now that we're armed with the understanding of our sacred pledge, we need to consider how we might respond when we overhear perhaps colleagues in the workplace repeating these common misconceptions about Freemasonry. Maybe they're suggesting it's some occult organization or its charitable work serve as a cover for more questionable activities. Well, rather than uncomfortably remaining silent, you might say, "I'm actually a Freemason, and I'd be happy to share what our organization is really about, because you have it completely wrong." And a simple intervention here fulfills our duty not just to defend the fraternity, but it actually opens the door for greater understanding. You see, the digital age of misinformation, especially about Freemasonry, spreads rapidly through websites, social media, and forums. When we encounter such content and merely scroll past saying, it's not worth engaging, or no one takes these conspiracy theories seriously, well, we're failing to uphold that Masonic vow. The fact that we might face ridicule or hostility is not sufficient reason to remain silent, especially when these falsehoods are being spread, because our duty specifically calls for courage in the face of potential social discomfort. So, in embracing the non-negotiable nature of our responsibility, we must acknowledge that sometimes the most challenging situations arise when these public criticisms do contain some elements of truth, even alongside mischaracterizations. It's here our commitment to truth requires us to acknowledge valid criticisms while correcting those distortions. If we're criticized for our historical exclusionary practices within Freemasonry, such as not admitting women, we have to acknowledge that historical reality, but also correct it, because there are women-only Grand Lodges that have been admitting women as Freemasons for over 100 years. But they still uphold the principles of Freemasonry. Apart from the gender, they are, to all accounts, appear to be regular. So it's this balanced approach where we acknowledge, some Grand Lodges are men's only, some Grand Lodges are women only, and traditionally we've been a men's only organization. But this balanced approach to dealing with these criticisms, which contain that element of truth, maintains our integrity, and it fulfills our duty to defend against misrepresentation. And it doesn't mean we should engage in aggressive arguments or hostile corrections. Rather, it calls for firm, clear responses that present accurate information about our Masonic principles and practices. And when you encounter this online misinformation, a Mason can fulfill his promise by posting factual corrections, sharing links to reputable Masonic sources, or even creating educational content that addresses these misconceptions themselves. You see, developing the moral courage to boldly confront slander against Freemasonry requires deliberate practice and preparation. We can educate ourselves thoroughly about our history, our principles, our practices, to ensure that we can provide accurate information when challenged. We can practice articulating those in clear and concise explanations of what Freemasonry is, more importantly, what Freemasonry is not. And we can do these in ways that resonate with non-Masons so they can understand. But most importantly, we need to remind ourselves that when we defend Freemasonry's reputation, we're not merely protecting an institution, but preserving the good name of every brother, past, present, and future, who identifies within our fraternity. And by translating our philosophical understanding into these practical actions, especially in the public sphere, we make this ancient commitment relevant and effective in our contemporary lives as Masons. So I challenge each brother to approach the next encounter with misinformation about our craft not as an awkward inconvenience, but as a privileged opportunity to fulfill your Masonic promise. Prepare yourself with knowledge. Cultivate the courage to speak when silence would be easier, and develop the wisdom to correct with dignity rather than defensiveness. Remember that in those moments when you defend Freemasonry's good name, you stand in a long line of brothers who have preserved our reputation through centuries of challenge and change. Your voice raised in thoughtful correction of falsehood is not your own. It's the voice of Freemasonry itself, speaking truth across generations, because after all, it's the non-negotiable duty of every Mason.